The alarm screamed through Flight Simulator Room 3 as Tyler Harrison's hands trembled over the controls. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in angry red as the artificial storm outside the windows grew more violent. His instructor, Captain Marcus Webb, watched with growing concern as the rookie pilot's confidence crumbled under the pressure of the emergency scenario. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The simulated Boeing 737 was diving toward the mountains, and Tyler was frozen. That's when Elena Rodriguez quietly set down her cleaning cart, stepped into the cockpit, and calmly reached for the yoke. What happened next would change everything everyone thought they knew about the woman who emptied their trash cans every night. The pre-dawn darkness still clung to the peaks of the Colorado Rockies as Elena Rodriguez pushed her cleaning cart through the empty corridors of Clearwater Regional Airport. Her footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors, the only sound accompanying the distant hum of overnight cargo operations. At 42, Elena had perfected the art of invisibility. Airport staff hurried past her without a second glance, their minds focused on schedules, passengers, and the endless complexity of keeping aircraft moving safely through one of the region's busiest hubs. Elena wore the standard-issue navy blue uniform of Mountain View Cleaning Services, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun that had seen better days. Her hands, though calloused from years of manual labor, moved with surprising precision as she methodically cleaned each surface. There was something almost ritualistic about her movements, attention to detail that went beyond what her minimum wage job required. She knew every inch of this airport, every hallway, every office, every maintenance area. More importantly, she knew every aircraft type that landed here, though that knowledge was something she kept carefully hidden. The Horizon Airlines training facility occupied the entire third floor of the airport's administrative building. During the day, it bustled with activity as pilots ran through emergency scenarios, flight attendants practiced safety procedures, and mechanics attended recertification courses. But in these quiet morning hours, Elena found a different kind of peace here. She would clean the classrooms methodically, her eyes inevitably drawn to the aviation charts on the walls, the aircraft manuals left open on desks, the technical diagrams that most people found incomprehensible. Elena paused at the window overlooking the main runway, watching as a FedEx cargo plane touched down with perfect precision. Even in the dim light, she could identify it immediately as a Boeing 757-200 OF, noting the slight crosswind correction the pilot made just before touchdown. She found herself mentally calculating the approach speed, the landing distance required, the fuel consumption for a flight of that weight and distance. These calculations came as naturally to her as breathing, a muscle memory from another life that she'd never quite been able to forget. Her reflection in the window showed a woman that most people would describe as unremarkable. Average height, practical clothing, the kind of person who blended into the background of everyday life. But her eyes held a sharpness that spoke of intelligence and experience far beyond what her current circumstances suggested. Elena had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant becoming invisible, letting people see only what they expected to see. The training facility's main corridor was lined with photographs of Horizon Airlines fleet and notable pilots throughout the company's history. Elena cleaned each frame carefully, her eyes scanning the faces of men and women who commanded multi-million-dollar aircraft, who carried hundreds of passengers safely across thousands of miles every day. She knew most of their names, their certifications, their flight hours. She'd made it her business to know, though she couldn't quite explain why even to herself. Carlos Mendez found her there 20 minutes later, mopping the floor outside Flight Simulator Room 3 with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Carlos was one of the few people at Clearwater Regional who saw Elena as more than just another member of the cleaning crew. As a veteran aircraft mechanic with 30 years of experience, he had an eye for people who understood aviation, and something about Elena had always intrigued him. "Morning, Elena," he said, settling his large frame against the doorway. "Early start today?" "Same as always," she replied, not looking up from her work. "The night freight crews leave quite a mess in the break rooms." Carlos studied her for a moment. In their brief conversations over the past 2 years, he'd noticed things about Elena that others missed. She asked questions about aircraft that went beyond casual curiosity. She understood technical terminology that most people outside the industry wouldn't know. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, he'd seen her studying the flight. Training materials left in classrooms with an intensity that suggested more than passing interest. "You know," Carlos said carefully, "there's a rumor going around that they're having trouble finding enough qualified pilots for the regional routes. Pay's not great, but the hours are decent." Elena's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. "I imagine flying requires quite a bit of training," she said neutrally. "Some folks have the training but just need the opportunity," Carlos replied. "And some folks have been flying longer than they've been doing other things, if you know what I mean." Their eyes met briefly, and Elena saw understanding there. Carlos had suspected, she realized. Somehow, despite all her careful invisibility, he'd seen through her disguise. The knowledge should have terrified her, but instead, she felt an unexpected sense of relief. Carrying secrets for so long was exhausting, and having one person who might understand was both dangerous and comforting. "I should get back to work," Elena said finally. "The morning shift supervisors will be in soon." Carlos nodded but didn't move. "Elena, I don't know your story, and I'm not asking. But I've been around aviation long enough to recognize someone who belongs in a cockpit when I see them. Just remember that sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as risks." After he left, Elena continued her work in silence, but his words echoed in her mind. She thought about the life she'd built here in Colorado, the careful anonymity she'd cultivated, the reasons she'd walked away from flying in the first place. The divorce had been brutal, the custody battle even worse. When her ex-husband used his connections and influence to destroy her reputation in the tight-knit aviation community, she'd been left with a choice: fight a battle she couldn't win, or disappear and start over somewhere no one would look for a former airline pilot. She'd chosen survival, but survival had come at a cost. Every day she spent cleaning these hallways was a day she wasn't doing what she was born to do. Every night she went home to her small apartment, she felt the weight of unused skills, of a passion that had no outlet. She'd trained at Rocky Mountain Aviation Academy 15 years ago, graduating at the top of her class. She'd flown for Mountain West Airlines for 8 years, accumulating over 4,000 hours of flight time on everything from small regional jets to wide-body aircraft. She'd handled emergency situations that would have terrified most pilots, landed aircraft in conditions that pushed the limits of what was considered safe. But none of that mattered now. On paper, Elena Rodriguez was a cleaning lady with a high school education and no particular skills beyond knowing how to make floors shine and trash cans empty. The woman who had once commanded a Boeing 767 across the Pacific was as invisible as if she'd never existed. Elena finished cleaning the training facility and moved on to the administrative offices. Dawn was beginning to break over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. There was something about being above the clouds, seeing the world spread out below like a living map, that had made her feel more alive than anything else ever had. As she worked, she could hear the airport coming to life around her. The first passenger flights of the day were being prepped. Ground crews were conducting their safety checks, and soon the corridors would fill with travelers beginning their journeys to destinations across the country. Elena would fade into the background, invisible among the controlled chaos of commercial aviation. Just another worker whose presence was necessary, but unremarkable. She passed the office of Jim Patterson, Horizon Airlines operations manager, and could see him through the glass walls reviewing flight schedules with his morning coffee. Patterson was a decent man who treated the cleaning crew with respect, always saying hello and thank you. He had no idea that the woman who emptied his trash can every morning had more flight hours than half of his pilot roster. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She was surrounded by the industry she loved, close enough to touch the life she'd lost, but separated by circumstances and choices that felt as insurmountable as the mountains, visible through the airport's windows. She'd told herself that this job was temporary, just until she figured out her next move. But 2 years had passed, and the next move still felt as distant as ever. Elena's radio crackled with a message from her supervisor. There was a coffee spill in the training facility that needed immediate attention. She turned her cart around and headed back toward the simulators, unaware that the day she'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure was about to begin. As she approached Flight Simulator Room 3, she could hear voices inside. Tyler Harrison, a rookie pilot in his mid-20s, was scheduled for an early morning emergency procedures session with Captain Marcus Webb. Elena had seen Tyler around the airport over the past few weeks, his nervous energy and eager to please attitude marking him clearly as someone new to commercial aviation. He reminded her of herself 15 years ago, full of determination and passion, but still learning to handle the enormous responsibility that came with holding hundreds of lives in your hands. Captain Webb's voice carried through the door, calm and authoritative as he explained the scenario they were about to run. Elena had worked around Webb long enough to recognize his reputation as one of Horizon's most experienced instructors, though she'd also noticed his tendency to be particularly hard on pilots he considered unprepared or unsuitable for the demands of commercial aviation. Elena knocked softly before entering to clean up the spilled coffee. The two men barely acknowledged her presence as she efficiently mopped up the mess near the simulator entrance. To them, she was simply part of the airport's invisible workforce, no more noteworthy than the cleaning supplies she carried. But Elena noticed everything. She saw Tyler's hands shaking slightly as he reviewed his checklist. She heard the tension in Webb's voice as he explained the complexity of the emergency scenario they were about to simulate. She recognized the aircraft type programmed into the simulator and knew exactly what challenges the weather conditions would present. Most importantly, she saw the setup for a situation that would test Tyler far beyond his current abilities. As Elena finished cleaning and prepared to leave, she heard Webb's final instructions to Tyler. They would be simulating a severe weather emergency with multiple system failures over mountainous terrain. It was exactly the kind of scenario that separated competent pilots from those who shouldn't be in a cockpit when passengers' lives were at stake. Elena quietly closed the door behind her and positioned her cart in the hallway, officially out of the way, but close enough to hear what happened next. She told herself she was just being cautious, making sure she was available if they needed anything else cleaned up. But deep down, she knew she was staying because some instinct told her that Tyler Harrison was about to face more than he could handle, and sometimes the difference between life and death in aviation came down to having the right person in the right place at exactly the right moment. The morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains as Elena waited in the hallway, listening to the sound of engines spooling up in the simulator. Inside that room, Tyler Harrison was about to discover just how unforgiving aviation could be when everything went wrong at once. And outside that room, Elena Rodriguez was about to face a choice between the safety of her carefully constructed invisibility and the possibility of being seen for who she really was. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to intersect in a way that would change everything they thought they knew about courage, competence, and the power of being underestimated. The morning briefing room buzzed with the kind of energy that came from pilots discussing the technical challenges of their profession. Elena pushed her cart quietly along the perimeter, emptying waste baskets and wiping down surfaces while conversations about weather patterns, aircraft performance, and regulatory changes flowed around her like she was a piece of furniture. Captain Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of 5 pilots who were scheduled for various training sessions throughout the day. "Gentlemen," Webb said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had logged over 15,000 flight hours across 3 decades. "Today's weather system moving through the Rockies is going to provide some excellent real-world training conditions. We've got severe turbulence, wind shear potential, and visibility dropping to minimums at several airports in our route network." Elena continued her work methodically, but her trained ear caught every detail of Webb's briefing. She knew the weather pattern he was describing intimately. 3 years ago, she had successfully navigated an actual emergency, landing in similar conditions when an engine failure forced her to divert to Denver International during a blizzard. The memory of that flight was still vivid, the way the aircraft had bucked and fought against the wind, the careful calculations required to maintain control with reduced power, the split-second decisions that had brought 127 passengers safely to the ground. Tyler Harrison sat in the front row, his notebook filled with detailed notes, his expression a mixture of concentration and barely concealed anxiety. At 26, he had all the technical knowledge required for commercial aviation, but experience was something that could only be earned through time and challenges. He'd graduated from flight school 6 months ago with excellent grades and strong recommendations, but the transition from controlled training environments to the unpredictable realities of commercial flying was proving more difficult than he'd anticipated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Harrison," Webb's voice cut through the room, "you're scheduled for emergency procedures in Sim 3 at 0900. I want you to review the severe weather protocols one more time before we begin. Today's scenario will test your decision-making under pressure." Tyler nodded enthusiastically, though Elena noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he made another note. She'd seen that combination of eagerness and nerves before in young pilots. Some rose to the challenge and became excellent aviators. Others discovered that the weight of responsibility for human lives was more than they could handle. The simulator would reveal which category Tyler belonged to. Derek Stone, a co-pilot with 2 years of experience, leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who believed his limited experience made him an expert. "Emergency procedures are mostly about staying calm," he said, addressing Tyler but speaking loud enough for the room to hear. "The aircraft practically flies itself these days. Just follow your checklists and don't overthink things." Elena paused in her cleaning, recognizing the dangerous oversimplification in Derek's advice. Modern aircraft were indeed sophisticated, but that sophistication could become a liability when multiple systems failed simultaneously. She'd learned that lesson during her own early career when overconfidence had nearly cost her and her passengers their lives. The memory of that flight, early in her career with Mountain West Airlines, still haunted her. She'd been flying a similar route when hydraulic failure combined with severe weather had created a cascade of problems that required every bit of skill and experience she possessed. Webb's expression suggested he didn't appreciate Derek's unsolicited commentary. "Mr. Stone, I'd remind you that complacency has been a factor in more aviation accidents than equipment failure. The moment a pilot stops respecting the complexity of what we do is the moment they become dangerous." Derek shrugged, unimpressed by the correction. Elena had encountered pilots like him throughout her career, individuals who mistook familiarity with routine operations for mastery of the profession. They were the ones who struggled most when faced with genuine emergencies. when their limited experience collided with situations that demanded creativity and deep understanding. Rachel Kim, the duty air traffic controller, entered the briefing room carrying a stack of weather reports. Elena knew Rachel by reputation as one of the most competent controllers at Clearwater Regional, someone who could manage complex traffic flows and emergency situations with equal skill. Rachel's presence usually meant something significant was developing weather-wise. "Captain Webb," Rachel said, "I wanted to give you a heads up about the storm system that's building. We're looking at some pretty severe conditions developing over the next few hours. Wind shear alerts are already posted for 3 airports in your training network." Elena's attention sharpened. Wind shear was one of aviation's most dangerous phenomena, capable of causing rapid altitude and airspeed changes that could overwhelm even experienced pilots. She'd encountered it twice in her career, both times requiring immediate and decisive action to prevent catastrophic loss of control. The first time had been during her training at Rocky Mountain Aviation Academy, when her instructor had used it as a teaching moment about the importance of recognizing dangerous conditions before they became critical. The second time had been real, approaching Denver during a winter storm, with a cabin full of passengers who had no idea how close they'd come to disaster. "How severe are we talking?" Webb asked, his tone becoming more serious. "Microbursts. Confirmed at 2 locations, with potential for more as the system intensifies. The Weather Service is predicting conditions that could challenge even experienced crews," Rachel replied. Tyler's face went pale as he listened to the exchange. Elena could see his confidence wavering as the reality of what he might face in the simulator began to sink in. Emergency procedures training was designed to be challenging, but when combined with actual severe weather conditions, it became a genuine test of a pilot's ability to handle the unexpected. Derek, however, seemed unconcerned by the weather update. "Sounds like perfect training conditions," he said with a grin. "Nothing like a little turbulence to keep things interesting." Elena wanted to shake him. That attitude, that casual dismissal of dangerous conditions, was exactly what led to accidents. Weather wasn't something to be entertained by. It was a force that demanded respect and careful planning. She'd seen too many pilots injured or killed because they failed to appreciate the power of atmospheric phenomena. Webb dismissed the briefing with instructions for each pilot to review their specific training scenarios. As the room emptied, Elena continued her cleaning while listening to the conversations that continued in the hallway. Tyler remained behind, studying his notes with the intensity of someone trying to memorize information that might save his life. "Nervous?" Elena found herself asking before she could stop herself. Tyler looked up, surprised that the cleaning lady had spoken to him. For a moment, his professional reserve wavered, and she could see the young man beneath the pilot's uniform. "A little," he admitted. "Captain Webb has a reputation for creating scenarios that push pilots to their limits." "Challenging scenarios make better pilots," Elena said carefully, aware that offering advice might reveal more about her background than was safe. "The key is remembering that the aircraft wants to fly. Your job is to help it do what it's designed to do, even when conditions aren't ideal." Tyler studied her with new interest. "You sound like you know something about flying." Elena felt a moment of panic. She'd let her guard down, allowed her knowledge to show through the carefully constructed facade of invisible service worker. "I watch a lot of aviation documentaries," she said quickly, returning to her cleaning with renewed focus. But Tyler wasn't deterred. "My grandfather was a pilot," he said. "He used to tell me that the best aviators were the ones who understood that flying was as much about judgment as skill. He said you could teach someone to operate an aircraft, but you couldn't teach them to think like a pilot." Elena paused in her work, struck by the wisdom in those words. Tyler's grandfather had understood something that many modern pilots missed in their focus on technology and procedures. Flying was ultimately about making good decisions under pressure, about understanding not just what the instruments were telling you, but what they meant in the context of atmospheric conditions, aircraft performance, and human limitations. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man, Elena said. He was, Tyler replied. He flew cargo in Alaska for 30 years. Said the weather up there taught him more about aviation than any textbook ever could. Alaska. Elena had always wanted to fly those routes, to test herself against some of the most challenging conditions in commercial aviation. The pilots who flew in Alaska developed skills that served them well anywhere in the world, learning to read weather patterns, navigate by landmarks, and make decisions with limited information. Tyler's grandfather would have been exactly the kind of mentor every young pilot needed. Derek Stone reappeared in the doorway, his expression slightly irritated. Tyler, you coming? Webb wants us in the sim prep room in 10 minutes. Tyler gathered his materials quickly, but as he reached the door, he turned back to Elena. Thank you, he said simply. Elena nodded, watching as the two young pilots disappeared down the hallway. She had no idea what Tyler was thanking her for, but something in his expression suggested that their brief conversation had meant more to him than she'd intended. The morning progressed with Elena moving through her routine cleaning tasks, but her attention kept returning to the training facility. She found excuses to work in areas where she could monitor the progress of various training sessions, listening to radio chatter from the control tower and observing the body language of instructors and students as they moved between classrooms and simulators. Carlos Mendez found her again around 10:30, this time in the maintenance break room where she was restocking supplies. Heard there's some interesting weather moving in, he said, settling into one of the plastic chairs with his morning coffee. The controllers seem concerned, Elena replied neutrally. Weather like this separates the real pilots from the wannabes, Carlos observed. I've seen guys who could fly textbook approaches fall apart the moment conditions got challenging. Elena knew he was right. She'd witnessed the same phenomenon throughout her career. Pilots who excelled in controlled conditions sometimes lacked the adaptability and judgment required when faced with rapidly changing circumstances. The best aviators were those who remained calm and methodical, regardless of external pressures, who could process multiple sources of information simultaneously and make decisions based on incomplete data. That young pilot, Harrison, Carlos continued, he seems like he's got potential, but he's green. Today's going to be a real test for him. Captain Webb is supervising, Elena said. He's experienced enough to keep things safe. Carlos gave her a sharp look. You seem to know quite a bit about the pilot roster for someone who cleans offices. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. Once again, she'd revealed too much, allowed her knowledge to slip through her carefully maintained disguise. I pay attention, she said simply. Yeah, Carlos said slowly, I bet you do. Before Elena could respond, the radio on Carlos's belt crackled with a message from the tower. Weather conditions were deteriorating faster than expected, and several scheduled training flights had been canceled as a precaution. Only the simulator sessions would continue, since they provided the opportunity to practice emergency procedures without actual risk. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Simulator training was valuable, but it had limitations. The physical sensations of turbulence, the visceral impact of wind shear, the way fear could affect decision-making, these were things that could only be fully experienced in actual flight conditions. If Tyler was going to face his first real emergency, she hoped it would be in the controlled environment of the simulator rather than in the unforgiving skies over the Colorado Rockies. The rest of the morning passed slowly, with Elena completing her assigned tasks while monitoring the increasing tension throughout the airport. Weather updates became more frequent and more dire. Ground crews began securing aircraft and equipment. As wind speeds increased, The atmosphere in the terminal shifted from routine efficiency to the heightened awareness that came when nature reminded everyone involved in aviation just how small they really were. Elena finished her morning route and returned her cart to the cleaning supply closet. But instead of taking her scheduled break, she found herself walking past Flight Simulator Room 3. The session should have started 20 minutes ago, but she could hear raised voices from inside. Webb's tone carried frustration, while Tyler's responses sounded increasingly stressed. She knew she should walk away, return to her invisible routine, and let the aviation professionals handle their own affairs. But something kept her standing in that hallway, listening to the sounds of a young pilot struggling with concepts that would determine whether he had a future in commercial aviation. Elena had been in Tyler's position once, facing an instructor who demanded excellence and wouldn't accept anything less. The difference was that she'd had mentors who helped her develop the confidence and judgment that couldn't be taught from textbooks. Through the partially open door, she could see Tyler's reflection in the simulator windows. His face was flushed with concentration and embarrassment as Webb critiqued his performance during what appeared to be a routine approach. Elena couldn't see the instrument panel from her position, but she could tell from Tyler's body language that he was struggling with the basic mechanics of the exercise, let alone preparing for the complex emergency scenarios that would follow. "Harrison," Webb's voice carried clearly into the hallway, "if you can't handle a standard approach in mild turbulence, how do you expect to manage when everything starts going wrong at once?" Elena winced at the harshness in the instructor's tone. While demanding standards were essential in aviation training, crushing a student's confidence served no useful purpose. Tyler needed support and guidance, not humiliation. She'd seen, too, many promising pilots destroyed by instructors who mistook intimidation for education. A memory surfaced from her own training days at Rocky Mountain Aviation Academy. She'd been struggling with instrument approaches in her first year, unable to maintain the precision required for commercial aviation. Her instructor, Captain Patricia Vasquez, had taken her aside after a particularly difficult session and offered advice that had changed everything. "Elena, you're trying to control the aircraft instead of flying with it. Stop fighting the machine and start listening to what it's telling you." That advice had transformed Elena's flying, helping her develop the intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. Tyler needed someone to give him similar guidance, to help him move beyond mechanical manipulation of controls to genuine comprehension of flight dynamics. Elena glanced at her watch and realized her lunch break was approaching. She could use that time to grab coffee and a sandwich, to sit in the employee break room and pretend she didn't know that a young pilot's career might be determined by his performance over the next few hours. Or she could find a way to position herself where she might be able to help if the situation deteriorated further. The choice should have been obvious. Elena had spent 2 years building a life based on invisibility and anonymity. Getting involved in training situations would draw attention she couldn't afford, might lead to questions about her background that could unravel everything she'd worked to construct. The smart choice was to walk away, to let Tyler Harrison succeed or fail based on his own abilities and the guidance of his assigned instructor. But as Elena stood in that hallway, listening to the sounds of struggle from inside the simulator, she realized that some choices transcended personal safety. Tyler reminded her of herself at 26, full of passion for aviation, but lacking the experience and confidence that came only through overcoming challenges. If she walked away and he failed, if his career ended before it truly began because no one was willing to offer the right guidance at the right moment, she would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life. Elena made her decision. She would find a way to stay close to the training session, to monitor Tyler's progress and be available if circumstances demanded her intervention. It was a risk that terrified her, but it was also an opportunity to remember who she had been before circumstances forced her to become invisible. The woman who had once landed a crippled aircraft in a blizzard with 127 souls on board was still inside her, waiting for the moment when her skills might once again make the difference between safety and disaster. The afternoon storm struck. Clearwater Regional with a ferocity that caught even the most experienced meteorologists off guard. Elena watched through the terminal windows as ground crews scrambled to secure equipment, while sheets of rain lashed across the runways. Lightning split the sky in jagged, brilliant lines, and the wind howled with enough force to rock the massive aircraft parked at the gates. Inside the climate-controlled environment of the airport, the storm felt distant and manageable, but Elena knew that any pilot caught in conditions like these would face the ultimate test of their training and judgment. She had positioned herself strategically in the hallway outside the simulator rooms, ostensibly cleaning the same section of floor for the third time while monitoring the increasingly tense situation developing in Simulator Room 3. Through the partially open door, she could hear Captain Webb's voice growing more frustrated as Tyler struggled with what should have been routine procedures. The storm outside had provided Webb with an opportunity to create training scenarios that matched the actual conditions developing across the region, and Tyler was discovering that his textbook knowledge wasn't translating into practical competence. "Harrison, your approach speed is 15 knots too high, and you're drifting left of the center line." Webb's voice carried the sharp edge that came when patience had been exhausted. In conditions like these, precision isn't optional. It's the difference between getting your passengers home safely and becoming a statistic. Elena could hear the rapid beeping of warning systems from inside the simulator, the audio cues that indicated Tyler was pushing the aircraft beyond safe operating parameters. She recognized the specific combination of sounds, the cascade of alerts that occurred when a pilot lost situational awareness and began making decisions based on panic rather than training. It was a situation she'd witnessed too many times, both in simulators and in actual flight conditions. Derek Stone appeared in the hallway, walking with the casual confidence of someone who believed the storm outside was merely an inconvenience rather than a genuine threat. He paused near Elena's position, apparently intending to observe Tyler's session through the window. Elena continued her methodical cleaning while listening to Derek's running commentary on Tyler's performance. "Poor bastard's completely overwhelmed," Derek muttered to himself, loud enough for Elena to hear. "Webb's really putting him through the ringer today. Probably should have started him on something easier before throwing him into severe weather scenarios." Elena wanted to tell Derek that severe weather didn't wait for pilots to feel ready, that the storm raging outside could easily create emergency conditions that would test even experienced crews. But she remained silent, continuing her work while Derek watched Tyler's struggles with what appeared to be amusement rather than concern for a fellow pilot's development. The sound of raised voices from inside the simulator drew both Elena's and Derek's attention. Webb had apparently stopped the exercise to address fundamental problems with Tyler's technique, and the conversation was becoming heated. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong." Tyler's voice carried frustration and embarrassment in equal measure. The approach seemed stable until the wind shear alert activated. "The wind shear didn't just appear," Webb replied sharply. "The conditions were building for the past 10 minutes. A competent pilot would have recognized the signs and initiated a go-around before the situation became critical. You flew directly into a microburst that should have been obvious from your weather radar display." Elena closed her eyes, remembering her own encounter with a microburst during her second year with Mountain West Airlines. She'd been flying into Phoenix during monsoon season when similar conditions had developed. Unlike Tyler, she'd recognized the telltale signs early and executed a go-around that had avoided disaster. But the experience had taught her to respect the power of atmospheric phenomena that could destroy aircraft in seconds. Derek pushed open the door to the simulator room and stepped inside without invitation. Elena could see him through the doorway, his presence adding another layer of pressure to an already stressful situation. "Mind if I observe?" Derek asked, though he was already settling into one of the observer seats. Always interesting to see how the new guys handle challenging scenarios. Elena saw Tyler's shoulders sag slightly at Derek's casual intrusion. The young pilot was already struggling with Webb's demanding instruction, and the addition of an audience seemed to shake his confidence further. Elena had experienced similar situations during her own training, moments when the pressure of being evaluated combined with the complexity of the task to create a perfect storm of stress and poor decision-making. Webb reset the simulator for another attempt, this time programming an even more challenging scenario that combined the severe weather with multiple system failures. Elena could see the exercise parameters on the instructor's display screen, and she recognized immediately that Webb was setting Tyler up for a situation that would test limits that the young pilot hadn't yet developed. "This time," Webb announced, "you'll be dealing with severe turbulence, wind shear, and a hydraulic system failure. The scenario begins with you on final approach to Denver International. Visibility 1 mile in heavy rain, crosswinds gusting to 40 knots. Elena felt her heart rate increase as she listened to the scenario description. She'd faced similar conditions in reality, and even with her experience, it had required every bit of skill and knowledge she possessed to bring the aircraft safely to the ground. Tyler was about to attempt something that challenged veteran pilots, and he was already struggling with basic procedures. The simulator engine spooled up again, and Elena could hear Tyler working through his pre-landing checklist with the mechanical precision of someone following memorized procedures, rather than understanding their purpose. His radio calls to the simulated air traffic control were technically correct but lacked the confidence that came with genuine comprehension of the situation. "Denver Tower, horizon 247, 5 miles southeast. Requesting vectors for the ILS approach to runway 27. Tyler's voice carried the strain of someone trying to remember correct phraseology while managing multiple complex tasks simultaneously. The simulated controller's response introduced the first complications. "Horizon 247, Denver Tower, winds 270 at 35 gusting 42. Visibility 1 mile in heavy rain, braking action reported fair. Advise if you need vectors to hold until conditions improve." Elena knew that accepting the hold would be the prudent choice. Real-world pilots facing those conditions would typically elect to wait for improvement rather than attempt an approach that pushed the limits of aircraft and crew capabilities. But Tyler, perhaps feeling pressure from his observers, chose to continue with the approach. "Denver Tower, horizon 247 requests the approach." Tyler replied, his voice betraying uncertainty despite his words. Elena winced as she heard the decision. Tyler was about to attempt something that required experience and judgment he hadn't yet developed, and the consequences in the simulator would be educational rather than fatal. But if he carried this same decision-making process into actual flight operations, the results could be catastrophic. The approach began routinely enough, with Tyler managing to maintain course and altitude despite the increasing turbulence. Elena could hear the simulator reproducing the sounds of wind buffeting the aircraft, the groans and creaks that came when atmospheric forces tested the structural limits of the machine. Tyler's breathing became audible over the intercom system, rapid and shallow as stress began to affect his physiology. "Airspeed," Webb's voice cut through the cockpit noise. "You're 15 knots fast and climbing." Tyler made corrections, but Elena could tell from the audio cues that his inputs were too aggressive, causing the aircraft to oscillate rather than settling into stable flight parameters. She'd seen this pattern before in pilots who were fighting the aircraft rather than flying it, trying to force precision through mechanical manipulation rather than developing the intuitive feel that allowed the machine to perform as designed. The first system failure occurred at 800 feet above ground level, precisely when Tyler needed all his attention focused on the approach. Elena heard the distinctive sound of hydraulic pressure warnings, followed by Webb's announcement that primary flight controls were now operating on backup systems with reduced authority. "What's your response, Harrison?" Webb demanded. Tyler's reply came after too long a pause, time wasted on processing information that should have triggered immediate action. Engaging backup hydraulic system and reducing approach speed to compensate for reduced control authority. Technically correct, Elena thought, but delivered with the hesitation that indicated Tyler was recalling procedures rather than executing practiced responses. In a real emergency, that delay could mean the difference between recovery and disaster. Derek's voice added unwelcome commentary from the observer's seat. "Interesting technique there, Tyler. Most pilots would have declared an emergency and requested priority handling from a TC." Elena could hear Tyler's confusion as he tried to process Derek's criticism while managing the increasingly complex situation. Adding unsolicited advice during a critical phase of flight was exactly the kind of interference that led to accidents, but Derek seemed oblivious to the damage he was causing. The microburst struck at 400 feet, just as Tyler was attempting to compensate for the hydraulic problems. Elena heard the wind shear warning system activate, its urgent tones adding to the cacophony of alerts already sounding in the cockpit. The simulator reproduced the terrifying sensation of sudden altitude loss as powerful downdrafts drove the aircraft toward the ground, with forces that could exceed the power of the engines to counteract. "Go around, go around," Webb shouted. But Tyler was already behind the situation, his responses delayed by information overload and stress-induced confusion. Elena listened with growing alarm as Tyler attempted to execute the go-around procedure while fighting wind shear that was designed to test the limits of pilot capability. The engine sounds changed as Tyler applied full power, but Elena could tell from the audio cues that he wasn't maintaining the proper pitch attitude to arrest the descent. "Pull up, Harrison. You're descending through 200 feet. Tyler's voice cracked as he replied, "I'm trying. The controls aren't responding." Elena knew exactly what was happening. Tyler was experiencing the phenomenon that trapped many pilots in similar situations. Instead of trusting his instruments and maintaining proper technique, he was fighting the aircraft, pulling too hard on the controls, and creating a situation where the aircraft couldn't perform as designed. The wind shear was recoverable, but only if the pilot maintained precise control inputs and trusted the aircraft's capabilities. Derek's voice added to the chaos. "You need to add more power and pull harder on the yoke." Elena couldn't remain silent any longer. Derek's advice was exactly wrong, the kind of instinctive response that turned recoverable situations into fatal accidents. Without thinking about the consequences, she stepped into the simulator room. "No," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the confusion. "Reduce the back pressure and let the airspeed build. The aircraft can't climb if you're pulling it into a stall." The room fell silent except for the continuing sounds of the simulator. Emergency. Webb, Derek, and Tyler all turned to stare at Elena, their expressions ranging from surprise to indignation that the cleaning lady had dared to interrupt a training session. Derek recovered first, his voice dripping with condescension. "Excuse me, but this is a professional training session. I don't think we need cleaning advice on how to fly airplanes." Elena felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, the same emotion she'd experienced countless times when male colleagues had dismissed her knowledge based on gender or appearance. But this wasn't about ego or professional respect. Tyler was failing, and his failure was being accelerated by bad advice from someone who didn't understand the situation. "Your advice is going to get him killed," Elena said quietly, her eyes fixed on Derek. "Wind shear recovery requires precise technique, not brute force. He needs to reduce angle of attack and allow the aircraft to accelerate before attempting to climb Webb stepped forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Stone is a qualified commercial pilot, and you're interfering with official training procedures." Elena looked at Tyler, who was still struggling with the controls while the ground rushed up to meet the simulated aircraft. In seconds, the exercise would end in a simulated crash, and Tyler would carry the memory of that failure with him into actual flight operations. She could walk away, return to her invisible anonymity, and let the aviation professionals handle their own affairs. Or she could risk everything she'd built to prevent a young pilot from learning exactly the wrong lessons about emergency procedures. 4,700 hours, Elena said quietly, not taking her eyes off Tyler. Boeing 737, 757, and 767 type ratings. 8 years with Mountain West Airlines, including flights into Denver, Phoenix, and Salt Lake during severe weather conditions. I've recovered from actual wind shear encounters twice, both times in conditions worse than what he's facing right now. The room fell completely silent. Even the simulator sound seemed muted as the three men processed what Elena had just revealed. Derek's mouth was open in surprise. Webb's expression had shifted to careful evaluation, and Tyler was staring at her with something approaching hope. "That's impossible," Derek said finally. "You're a cleaning lady." Elena met his gaze steadily. "Right now I'm someone who knows how to recover from wind shear, and your advice is exactly what causes pilots to lose aircraft in these conditions. Tyler, listen to me. Reduce back pressure, lower the nose slightly, and let the airspeed build to rotation speed before attempting to climb. Trust your instruments, not your instincts." Tyler looked between Elena and Webb, uncertainty written across his features. The simulator was still descending through 100 feet, and seconds remained before the exercise would end in failure. Webb had the authority to stop the exercise, to reset the scenario, to dismiss Elena's interference as inappropriate. Instead, he stepped back slightly and nodded to Tyler. "Try her technique," Webb said quietly. Tyler's hands moved on the controls, following Elena's instructions with the precision of someone who had been given a lifeline in the midst of disaster. Elena watched the flight parameters on the instructor's display as Tyler reduced back pressure, allowed the nose to drop slightly, and watched the airspeed indicators climb back towards safe values. "Now add power gradually and begin your climb," Elena continued, her voice calm and authoritative. "Don't try to climb too steeply. Let the aircraft do what it's designed to do." Tyler followed her guidance, and Elena watched with satisfaction. As the aircraft began to recover from the wind shear encounter, the rate of descent decreased, then stopped, then slowly converted to a climb as Tyler maintained the precise balance between power and attitude that allowed the aircraft to escape. "The downdraft." "Outstanding," Webb said softly, his voice carrying genuine surprise. "Textbook wind shear recovery." Tyler's face was flushed with relief and exhaustion as he continued the climb to safe altitude. "I can't believe that worked," he said, his voice shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Elena stepped back toward the door, suddenly aware of what she had done. In the space of 5 minutes, she had destroyed the careful anonymity she'd spent 2 years constructing. These men now knew that the woman who cleaned their offices was a qualified commercial pilot with extensive experience. Questions would follow: investigations into her background, discovery of the circumstances that had driven her from aviation into invisibility. Derek was the first to recover from his shock, and his expression was not one of gratitude or respect. Instead, Elena could see anger and wounded pride, the reaction of someone whose authority had been challenged by someone he considered inferior. "So what's the story?" Derek demanded. "If you're such an experienced pilot, what are you doing pushing a mop around an airport? Did you lose your license? Get fired for incompetence?" Elena felt the familiar pain of old wounds being reopened. The assumptions, the immediate leap to explanations that put the blame on her rather than on circumstances beyond her control. She could explain about the divorce, the custody battle, the way her ex-husband had used his influence to destroy her reputation. But she knew that Derek had already decided what kind of story would satisfy his need to explain away her competence. "Personal reasons," Elena said simply, her voice carefully neutral. "Personal reasons," Derek repeated mockingly. "Right. Nobody walks away from a flying career for personal reasons. What really happened? DUI? Failed check ride? Medical issues?" Elena met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his aggressive questioning. She'd faced worse than Derek Stone, had overcome challenges that would have broken him. But she also knew that anything she said would be twisted to fit the narrative he was already constructing. Webb stepped between them, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Stone, that's enough, Ms." He paused, realizing he didn't know Elena's last name. "Rodriguez," Elena supplied. Ms. Rodriguez just demonstrated knowledge and skill that saved this training exercise from ending in simulated disaster. Whatever her background, I think we owe her some respect. Derek's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Respect? Webb, she's been lying to everyone here for who knows how long. Pretending to be something she's not, eavesdropping on training sessions, probably violating a dozen security protocols. And now you want to treat her like some kind of hero because she helped the new guy complete a basic recovery procedure?" Elena felt the situation spiraling beyond her control. Derek's accusations contained enough truth to be dangerous, enough distortion to be unfair. She had been deceiving people about her background, had been listening to conversations she had no business hearing. But she'd also just prevented a young pilot from learning techniques that could prove fatal in actual flight conditions. Tyler's voice cut through the argument. "She saved my life," he said quietly. "Maybe only in the simulator, but if I had carried those techniques into actual flight conditions and encountered real wind shear, I would have crashed. She gave me knowledge that could make the difference between bringing passengers home safely and becoming another accident statistic." Elena looked at Tyler with gratitude, seeing in his expression the understanding that Derek lacked. Tyler grasped the fundamental truth that aviation was ultimately about safety, about sharing knowledge that prevented accidents and saved lives. The politics of who was qualified to offer advice mattered less than whether that advice was correct and useful. But Derek wasn't finished. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice carrying the vindictive tone of someone who had been embarrassed and wanted revenge. "I think Ms. Rodriguez here has some explaining to do. To airport security, to Horizon Airlines management, to whoever issued her security clearance to work in restricted areas. This whole situation stinks of deception and potential security violations." Elena felt cold fear settling in her stomach. Derek had the power to destroy not just her anonymity, but her ability to work at the airport at all. A security investigation would uncover her real background, might lead to questions about why she'd hidden her qualifications, could result in charges related to misrepresentation on employment applications. Everything she'd built over the past 2 years could disappear because she'd been unable to watch a young pilot fail when she had the knowledge to help him succeed. Webb was studying Elena with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Miss Rodriguez," he said slowly, "would you be willing to continue working with Mr. Harrison on his emergency procedures training? It seems you have insights that could be valuable to his development as a pilot." Elena stared at Webb in surprise. She'd expected dismissal, investigation, potential criminal charges. Instead, he was offering her an opportunity to return to the work she loved, to share knowledge that had taken years to acquire. But accepting his offer would mean abandoning the safety of invisibility, stepping back into a world that had already rejected her once. Derek's voice rose in indignation. "You can't be serious, Webb. You're going to let some cleaning lady with a mysterious background start instructing our pilots? What's next? Asking the janitor to perform aircraft maintenance. Elena felt the moment of decision arriving like a storm front, unavoidable and potentially destructive. She could apologize, return to her cleaning cart, and hope that Derek's anger would fade with time. Or she could accept Webb's offer and face whatever consequences came from stepping back into the light. Tyler was watching her with hope and gratitude, seeing in her the mentor he needed to develop into the pilot he wanted to become. Webb was offering her a chance to return to aviation, to use her skills for their intended purpose. And Derek was promising to make her life as difficult as possible if she dared to accept opportunities he believed she didn't deserve. Elena Rodriguez, who had once landed a crippled aircraft in a blizzard, who had taught herself to become invisible to survive, who had spent 2 years hiding her light under a bushel basket, looked around the room at the 3 men whose lives she had just entered and made her choice. Elena looked directly at Captain Webb, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from years of making split-second choices in high-pressure situations. The woman who had once commanded commercial aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers was tired of hiding behind a mop and bucket, tired of watching others struggle with challenges she could help them overcome, tired of letting fear dictate her choices. "I accept," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in cockpits across the country. Derek Stone's face flushed red with indignation. "This is insane, Webb. You're going to let this woman, this fraud, work with our pilots based on what? A single simulator intervention? We don't know anything about her background, her credentials, her reasons for hiding in a cleaning uniform for 2 years." Elena met Derek's hostile gaze without flinching. She'd encountered his type throughout her aviation career, pilots who felt threatened by competence that didn't fit their preconceived notions of who belonged in a cockpit. "My logbooks are at home," she said calmly. "My certificates are current, though I haven't flown professionally in 2 years. If Captain Webb wants verification of my qualifications, I can provide documentation." Webb nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need to see those credentials, of course. But first, I'd like to understand what we just witnessed. That wind shear recovery technique you guided Tyler through, where did you learn it?" Elena felt the familiar weight of memories pressing against her carefully constructed defenses. Talking about her aviation background meant opening doors she'd kept locked for 2 years, revisiting experiences that had shaped her into the pilot she'd become before circumstances forced her into exile. Rocky Mountain Aviation Academy, initially. She began, her voice steady despite the emotional turbulence of remembering. But real understanding came from experiencing it firsthand. 3 years ago, flying Mountain West 847 from Phoenix to Denver, we encountered a microburst on final approach. Visibility dropped to 0, downdrafts exceeded 1,500 feet per minute, and we had a cabin full of passengers who trusted us to bring them home safely. Tyler leaned forward, his attention completely focused on Elena's words. Even Derek had stopped his protests, caught despite himself by the authority in her voice and the technical precision of her description. The first officer was relatively inexperienced, Elena continued, and when the wind shear warnings activated, his instinct was to pull hard on the yoke and apply maximum power. Standard emergency response, but exactly wrong for that situation. I had to override his inputs and execute the recovery using the technique I just taught Tyler. Nose down first to build airspeed, then gradual climb once we had sufficient energy to overcome the downdraft. Webb's expression had shifted from curiosity to respectful attention. "How many souls on board?" 127 passengers plus crew, Elena replied. "We diverted to Colorado Springs and landed safely, but it was close." The NTSB investigation concluded that following standard emergency procedures would have resulted in ground impact with insufficient altitude for recovery. The room fell silent as the implications of Elena's story settled over the 3 men. Derek's antagonism wavered as he processed the reality that the woman he'd been dismissing as a fraud had successfully handled an emergency that could have killed over 130 people. Tyler's expression showed something approaching awe as he realized the level of experience hidden behind Elena's humble facade. Webb broke the silence with a question that Elena had been dreading. "Ms. Rodriguez, if you have that kind of experience and skill, why are you working as custodial staff at this airport? What happened to your flying career?" Elena felt the old pain resurface, the bitter memories of legal battles and professional destruction that had driven her into hiding. She could deflect, offer vague explanations about personal circumstances, but Webb's direct question deserved an honest answer. More importantly, if she was going to step back into the aviation world, she needed these men to understand the forces that had shaped her journey. "My ex-husband," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "He was also a pilot senior, captain with Mountain West, well connected throughout the industry. When our marriage fell apart, he used those connections to destroy my reputation. Sexual harassment allegations that were investigated and dismissed, but the rumors persisted. Questions about my competence, suggestions that I'd advanced through preferential treatment rather than skill. By the time the legal battles ended, I couldn't get hired anywhere in commercial aviation." Derek's face showed a flicker of discomfort, perhaps recognizing behavior he'd witnessed or participated in throughout his own career. The aviation industry's treatment of women, particularly those who challenged male dominance in cockpits, was an open secret that most preferred not to discuss directly. Tyler's voice carried anger when he spoke. "That's completely unfair. If you had the qualifications and experience, those allegations should have been irrelevant." Elena smiled sadly at his naivety. "Should have been, yes. But aviation is still very much an old boys' network. When someone with influence decides to destroy your career, they can make it happen regardless of your actual capabilities. I fought for 18 months, but eventually I had to choose between continuing a battle I couldn't win and starting over somewhere no one would look for a disgraced female pilot." Webb's expression showed both understanding and regret. He'd been in aviation long enough to witness similar situations, to see qualified individuals pushed out of the industry by politics and prejudice that had nothing to do with their ability to safely operate aircraft. "So you came here," Webb said, "and hid your background to avoid being recognized." "Colorado was far enough from my previous roots that recognition was unlikely," Elena confirmed. "The cleaning job gave me access to aviation environments without drawing attention. I could stay close to the industry I loved while rebuilding my life in anonymity." Derek had been silent during Elena's explanation, his aggressive certainty replaced by obvious discomfort. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its earlier venom. "Even if your story is true, you've been operating under false pretenses. Airport security, employment documentation, background checks. You've deceived everyone here about who you really are." Elena nodded, accepting the truth of his accusation. "Yes, I have. I needed work, needed to disappear, needed to survive. I never intended to reveal my background, never planned to get involved in training situations. But when I heard Tyler struggling with concepts that could get him killed, I couldn't remain silent." Webb walked to the window overlooking the storm-lashed airport, his hands clasped behind his back as he processed the extraordinary situation that had developed in his training facility. Outside, lightning continued to split the sky while ground crews worked to secure equipment against winds that threatened to turn loose objects into dangerous projectiles. "Ms. Rodriguez," Webb said without turning around, "what's your assessment of Mr. Harrison's readiness for commercial operations?" Elena glanced at Tyler, who was watching her with obvious anxiety about her answer. She could see his potential, the foundation of knowledge and dedication that could be developed into genuine competence, but she also recognized the gaps in his. Experience that made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of situations that destroyed aircraft and killed passengers. He has excellent technical knowledge and strong motivation, Elena said carefully. But he lacks the experiential base to make good decisions under pressure. Today's wind shear scenario was perfectly manageable with proper technique, but Tyler was overwhelmed by information processing and conflicting advice. In actual flight conditions, that kind of confusion can be fatal. Tyler's face showed disappointment, but also determination. What do I need to do differently? How do I develop the kind of judgment you're talking about? Elena felt a familiar stirring of the teaching instinct that had once made her an effective mentor to younger pilots. Tyler's question showed exactly the kind of attitude that separated pilots who grew from their mistakes from those who repeated them until circumstances became unforgiving. Experience can't be rushed, Elena replied, but it can be guided. You need exposure to challenging scenarios with instructors who help you understand not just what to do, but why those actions work. More importantly, you need to develop confidence in your own abilities so you don't get paralyzed when multiple problems occur simultaneously. Derek interjected with obvious skepticism. And you think you're qualified to provide that kind of guidance? Based on what authority? Elena turned to face him directly, her patience with his antagonism finally exhausted. Based on 8 years of flying commercial routes and conditions that range from routine to life-threatening. Based on successfully handling emergencies that would have challenged pilots with twice Tyler's experience. Based on understanding that good training is about developing judgment, not just memorizing procedures. The confrontation that had been building throughout the afternoon finally erupted as Derek stepped closer to Elena, his voice rising with anger and wounded pride. You know what I think? I think you're a failed pilot who couldn't make it in the real aviation world, and now you're trying to insert yourself into training situations where you don't belong. Maybe you had some experience once, but hiding out as a cleaning lady for 2 years doesn't exactly inspire confidence in your current capabilities. Elena felt the familiar fire of combat rising in her chest, the same emotion that had carried her through countless challenges throughout her flying career. Derek was attacking not just her qualifications, but her character, questioning the very foundation of everything she'd worked to achieve in aviation. Current capabilities? Elena repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. You want to see current capabilities? Webb turned from the window, recognizing the shift in atmosphere that indicated the situation was about to escalate beyond verbal confrontation. Ms. Rodriguez, I don't think that's necessary. But Elena was beyond diplomatic restraint. Derek had pushed her past the point where careful words and measured responses would suffice. If he wanted proof of her abilities, she would provide it in terms that even his arrogance couldn't dismiss. Reset the simulator, Elena said, her eyes never leaving Derek's face. Program the same scenario Tyler just completed, but add the complications you'd encounter in actual flight conditions. Multiple system failures, communication problems, passenger medical emergency. Give me the full disaster scenario that separates competent pilots from those who just think they are. Derek's smile was predatory as he realized Elena was offering him exactly what he wanted, an opportunity to expose her as a fraud in front of witnesses who would remember her humiliation. You want to fly the scenario that just overwhelmed a commercial pilot with 6 months of experience? Even if you were as good as you claim, you've been out of practice for 2 years. Elena nodded calmly. 2 years of watching other people struggle with problems I could solve. 2 years of listening to advice that would get pilots killed. 2 years of keeping quiet while people like you demonstrate exactly why aviation. Accidents still happen despite all our technology and procedures. Tyler looked between Elena and Derek with growing alarm, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond professional disagreement into personal confrontation. Maybe we should all take a step back, he suggested. This doesn't need to become a competition. But Derek was already moving toward the simulator controls, his movements quick and aggressive as he began programming parameters that would create the most challenging scenario possible within the system's capabilities. "No, Tyler, this is exactly what needs to happen. Ms. Rodriguez wants to prove she belongs in a cockpit, so let's give her that opportunity." Webb attempted to intervene. "Mr. Stone, I don't think this is appropriate. Training scenarios should be educational, not punitive." Derek ignored the captain's concern, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he constructed a disaster scenario that would test the limits of pilot capability. Severe weather, multiple hydraulic failure, electrical problems, engine fire, cabin pressurization issues, and a passenger medical emergency requiring immediate landing. "Let's see how our cleaning lady handles a real emergency." Elena watched Derek's scenario construction with professional interest rather than concern. She'd faced similar combinations of problems in actual flight conditions, had learned through experience that complex emergencies were manageable if approached with proper priorities and systematic problem solving. Derek was creating exactly the kind of situation that revealed whether a pilot possessed genuine competence or merely textbook knowledge. "Add one more element," Elena said quietly. "Make it a night approach to an unfamiliar airport with minimum fuel. If you're going to test my capabilities, don't hold back." Derek's grin widened as he incorporated Elena's suggestion into the scenario. He was convinced that he was about to witness her complete failure, a humiliation that would validate his dismissal of her qualifications and restore his wounded pride. Tyler and Webb watched with growing apprehension as Elena calmly removed her cleaning uniform jacket and settled into the pilot's seat. She moved with the fluid precision of someone completely comfortable in a cockpit environment, her hands finding controls and switches with the muscle memory that came from thousands of hours of flight experience. Elena began her pre-flight scan methodically, checking instruments and systems with a thoroughness that had become second nature during her commercial flying career. Her movements were unhurried despite the complexity of the scenario awaiting her, demonstrating the calm confidence that separated experienced pilots from those still learning to trust their training. Derek initiated the scenario with obvious anticipation of Elena's failure. The simulator immediately began reproducing the sounds and sensations of multiple aircraft emergencies occurring simultaneously. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in angry red, while alert tones demanded immediate attention to problems that could individually challenge an experienced crew. Elena's response was immediate and systematic. Instead of allowing herself to be overwhelmed by the cascade of warnings, she began working through established priorities, addressing the most critical threats first, while mentally cataloging the secondary problems that would require attention once immediate safety was assured. "Engine fire, engine 2, she announced calmly, her hands moving to initiate the fire suppression procedures. Executing engine fire checklist, shutting down engine 2, discharging fire suppression system. Tyler watched in fascination as Elena's training and experience merged into smooth, professional competence. Her voice remained steady despite the complexity of the problems she was managing, each decision made with the kind of confidence that came from understanding rather than memorizing emergency procedures. Derek's smile began to fade as Elena successfully handled each element of his carefully constructed disaster scenario. The hydraulic failures that should have made aircraft control nearly impossible were managed through proper technique and understanding of backup systems. The electrical problems that could have left her flying blind were addressed through systematic troubleshooting that restored essential instruments. Webb found himself taking notes as Elena demonstrated textbook emergency management, combined with the kind of innovative problem-solving that distinguished exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. When the cabin pressurization failure threatened passenger safety, Elena initiated an emergency descent while simultaneously coordinating with simulated air traffic control to obtain priority handling. declaring emergency, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. Elena's radio call was professional and concise, providing controllers with essential information while avoiding the kind of lengthy explanations that wasted precious time during actual emergencies. The passenger medical emergency, designed to create additional pressure and distraction, was handled with the same systematic approach Elena brought to the mechanical problems. She coordinated with simulated flight attendants to gather essential medical information while continuing to fly the aircraft and manage the ongoing systems failures. Tyler began to understand that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Elena wasn't just handling Derek's disaster scenario. She was demonstrating mastery of emergency procedures that went far beyond textbook knowledge. Her actions showed the kind of integrated understanding that came from facing real emergencies where poor decisions resulted in tragedy rather than simulator resets. Derek's confident expression had been replaced by growing disbelief as Elena continued to manage problems that should have overwhelmed any pilot, regardless of experience level. The scenario he'd constructed to expose her as a fraud was instead revealing capabilities that exceeded his own understanding of what was possible in emergency situations. The final test came as Elena approached the unfamiliar airport with minimum fuel reserves while managing multiple system failures and the ongoing passenger medical emergency. Night conditions and deteriorating weather created visibility challenges that required her to execute an instrument approach with degraded navigation equipment and reduced control authority from the hydraulic problems. Elena's approach was flawless, her technique demonstrating the kind of precision that came from thousands of hours of experience in challenging conditions. She maintained perfect course and altitude control despite the multiple distractions, her radio communications clear and professional as she coordinated with tower controllers and emergency services. The landing was executed with such smoothness that observers initially failed to appreciate the extraordinary skill required to bring a damaged aircraft safely to the ground under those conditions. Elena completed her post-landing checklists methodically, securing systems and coordinating passenger evacuation with the same calm competence she'd shown throughout the emergency sequence. The simulator fell silent as Elena shut down the remaining engine and activated the parking brake. She sat quietly for a moment, allowing the adrenaline of the exercise to subside, before turning to face the three men who had witnessed her performance. Her expression showed satisfaction, but not arrogance, the quiet confidence of someone who had proven her point without need for dramatic gestures. Derek stood frozen beside the instructor station, his mouth slightly open as he processed what he had just witnessed. The scenario he'd designed to humiliate Elena had instead demonstrated flying skills that exceeded anything in his own experience. Every element of his carefully constructed disaster had been handled with professional competence that left no room for criticism or doubt. Webb was the first to find his voice. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "I've been instructing commercial pilots for 15 years, and I've never seen emergency management at that level. You handled problems that would challenge the most experienced crews like they were routine procedures." Tyler's expression showed something approaching reverence, as he realized the level of expertise that had been hidden behind Elena's humble facade. "I can't believe you've been working as a cleaning lady," he said. "You should be teaching at the academy, training airline pilots, sharing that knowledge with people who need to learn from your experience." Elena looked at Derek, waiting for his response to the demonstration he had demanded. His face showed a complex mixture of emotions, embarrassment and reluctant respect warring with the wounded pride that had driven his antagonism. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its earlier venom. "I was wrong," Derek said simply. "About your capabilities, about your qualifications, about everything. That was flying at a level I've never seen outside of emergency training videos. I apologize for questioning your competence." Elena nodded, accepting his apology without triumph or vindication. She understood the forces that had driven Derek's hostility, the insecurity and threatened masculinity that made some pilots hostile to competence that challenged their sense of superiority. His willingness to acknowledge his error showed character that she could respect, even if she couldn't excuse his earlier behavior. "The question now," Webb said, "is what happens next. Ms. Rodriguez, you've demonstrated capabilities that this training facility desperately needs. Would you be willing to consider a position as a flight instructor, working with pilots like Tyler who need the kind of guidance only experience can provide?" Elena felt the weight of decision settling over her like turbulence before a storm. Webb was offering her exactly what she'd dreamed about during 2 years of invisible exile, an opportunity to return to aviation and share the knowledge she'd accumulated through years of challenging flying. But accepting his offer meant abandoning the safety of anonymity, stepping back into a world that had already rejected her once. The storm outside had begun to weaken, its fury spent against the mountains that had stood unchanged for millennia. Through the windows, Elena could see the first breaks in the clouds, patches of clear sky that promised better conditions ahead. The metaphor wasn't lost on her as she considered whether to emerge from her own storm into whatever weather awaited in the aviation world she'd never really left behind. Elena Rodriguez stood at the window of Captain Webb's office 3 weeks later, watching the morning sun illuminate the snow-capped peaks of the Colorado Rockies. The storm that had raged through Clearwater Regional on that fateful afternoon had long since passed, leaving behind crystal-clear skies that stretched endlessly toward horizons that no longer seemed impossible to reach. She wore the navy blue uniform of a Horizon Airlines flight instructor, the silver wings pinned to her chest catching the early light like a promise finally kept. The transformation hadn't been immediate or simple. Elena's emergence from anonymity had required extensive documentation, the background verification, and delicate negotiations with airport security regarding her employment history. But Webb had proven to be a powerful advocate, using his influence and reputation to smooth the bureaucratic obstacles that could have derailed her return to aviation. More importantly, Jim Patterson, the operations manager who had unknowingly exchanged pleasantries with her every morning for 2 years, had chosen to focus on her qualifications rather than the deception that had brought her to his airport. The paperwork on Webb's desk told the story of Elena's remarkable rehabilitation. Her pilot certificates had been reactivated after a thorough review by the Federal Aviation Administration. Medical clearances had been obtained and validated. Most significantly, her employment file now accurately reflected her experience and qualifications, replacing the carefully constructed fiction that had sustained her through 2 years of exile. "The board approved your permanent appointment," Webb announced as he entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Starting next month, you'll be our senior instructor for emergency procedures and advanced weather operations. It comes with a salary that should allow you to stop worrying about rent payments." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, still adjusting to being treated as a colleague rather than invisible support staff. The financial security was welcome, but more important was the opportunity to return to work that utilized her skills and passion. Teaching other pilots, sharing hard-won knowledge that could prevent accidents and save lives, felt like stepping back into a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. "Tyler's made remarkable progress," Webb continued, settling behind his desk with the satisfaction of an instructor who had witnessed genuine growth. 3 weeks of focused training with you, and he's handling emergency scenarios that would have overwhelmed him before. More importantly, he's developing the confidence and judgment that can't be taught from textbooks." Elena smiled at the mention of Tyler Harrison. Working with him had been one of the most rewarding aspects of her return to aviation instruction. His eagerness to learn, combined with his willingness to admit mistakes and accept guidance, reminded her of why she'd been drawn to teaching throughout her flying career. Tyler represented the future of commercial aviation, but only if pilots like him received proper mentoring from instructors who understood the difference between procedural compliance and genuine competence. He's scheduled for his final check ride next week, Elena said. I think he's ready. The confidence issues that were paralyzing him have been replaced by steady decision-making and proper priority management. He'll make a good commercial pilot. Webb nodded with satisfaction. Tyler's improvement had been dramatic enough to attract attention from other instructors, several of whom had requested Elena's insights into training techniques that produced such rapid development. Her approach, which emphasized understanding over memorization and confidence building over intimidation, was already influencing the broader training culture at Horizon Airlines. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Derek. Stone entered with obvious nervousness, his usual swagger replaced by the humble demeanor of someone seeking forgiveness. In the 3 weeks since Elena's demonstration, Derek had struggled with the realization that his antagonism had nearly prevented a fellow pilot from receiving life-saving instruction. His conscience, apparently more developed than his initial behavior had suggested, wouldn't allow him to simply forget the incident and move forward. Elena, Derek said, his voice carrying genuine remorse, I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you. Not just the day in the simulator, but throughout your time here. I walked past you hundreds of times, never seeing you as anything more than part of the background. When I think about the knowledge and experience you could have shared, the insights that might have made me a better pilot, I realize how much my prejudice cost both of us. Elena studied Derek's face, seeing sincerity rather than the calculated words of someone trying to repair professional relationships. His apology went beyond the obvious issues of gender and class prejudice to acknowledge something deeper about the way people could become invisible when others decided they weren't worth noticing. We all make assumptions based on limited information. Elena replied diplomatically. What matters is learning from those mistakes and doing better going forward. Derek nodded gratefully, but his expression suggested he wasn't finished. I've been thinking about what you said, about aviation being an old boys network that pushes out qualified people for political reasons. I want to do something about that. Webb's asked me to work with human resources on developing policies that focus on competence rather than connections. Would you be willing to help with that project? Elena felt a surge of hope at Derek's proposal. Changing the culture that had nearly destroyed her career wouldn't happen overnight, but it would require advocates from within the existing power structure. Derek's willingness to acknowledge problems and work toward solutions suggested that positive change was possible, even in an industry resistant to self-examination. I'd be happy to contribute, Elena said. But the real change has to come from people like you, pilots who are willing to challenge assumptions and speak up when they see unfair treatment. My voice carries the baggage of being an outsider who fought the system and lost. Your voice represents the possibility of reform from within. Webb watched the exchange with obvious approval. The conversation between Elena and Derek represented exactly the kind of cultural evolution that aviation desperately needed. Too many qualified individuals had been lost to prejudice and politics, while less capable pilots advanced through connections and favoritism. Elena's return to aviation instruction provided an opportunity to model better approaches to evaluation and advancement. Carlos Mendez appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been thoroughly validated. As the mechanic who had first suspected Elena's true background, he'd become something of a celebrity among the airport's technical staff. His ability to recognize competence disguised by circumstances had earned him respect and admiration from colleagues who now paid closer attention to his insights about personnel and capabilities. Thought you'd like to know, Carlos announced. With obvious pleasure, the FAA investigator finished reviewing the incident reports from Elena's previous airline. Turns out her ex-husband's allegations were part of a pattern of harassment that affected several female pilots. The investigator recommended that her record be cleared of any negative notations related to those complaints. Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten how heavy it had become. Official vindication wouldn't undo the 2 years of exile or restore the career momentum she'd lost, but it validated her decision to fight back against the circumstances that had driven her into hiding. More importantly, it might prevent other qualified pilots from suffering similar injustices. "There's more," Carlos continued with a grin. "Mountain West Airlines' new chief pilot wants to meet with you about a position with their training department. Apparently, word about your emergency instruction techniques has spread beyond Horizon. You're developing quite a reputation in the industry." Elena felt simultaneously thrilled and overwhelmed by the possibility of returning to major airline operations. Mountain West had been her professional home for 8 years before the personal disaster that ended her flying career. The opportunity to return to that environment, but in a role that utilized her hard-won experience in emergency situations, felt like completing a circle that had been broken by circumstances beyond her control. Webb leaned forward with interest. "That would be quite an opportunity, Elena. Mountain West's training program influences standards throughout the industry. You could have a much broader impact there than you can with our regional operation." Elena nodded thoughtfully, but her response surprised everyone in the room. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm not ready to leave Horizon yet. Tyler and the other pilots I'm working with need consistency in their training. More importantly, I'm still learning how to be an instructor again. I want to perfect my techniques here before taking on larger responsibilities." Derek looked puzzled by Elena's decision. "You're turning down a chance to return to the major airlines? After everything you've been through, don't you want to get back to the highest levels of commercial aviation?" Elena smiled at his confusion, understanding that Derek's definition of success still focused on prestige and advancement rather than personal satisfaction and meaningful contribution. "I spent 8 years flying for Mountain West, and while I learned valuable skills and gained important experience, I never had the opportunity to teach or mentor other pilots. This position gives me the chance to share knowledge that took years to acquire, to help prevent accidents that kill passengers and destroy careers." She paused, looking out the window at the aircraft moving across the airport ramps, like pieces in an intricate choreography of modern transportation. "Besides, there's something to be said for building a program from the ground up, for creating training standards that prioritize competence and safety over politics and connections. Maybe what aviation needs isn't more pilots trying to climb the traditional ladder, but instructors willing to stay at regional levels and ensure the foundation is solid." Tyler Harrison appeared in the doorway, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had just successfully completed a challenging training exercise. In the 3 weeks since Elena had begun working with him intensively, his transformation had been remarkable. The nervous young pilot who had struggled with basic procedures had developed into someone capable of handling complex emergency scenarios with confidence and competence. "Elena," Tyler said excitedly, "I just finished the severe weather simulation with Captain Brooks. He said it was the best emergency management he'd seen from a pilot with my experience level. I couldn't have done it without everything you've taught me about staying calm and prioritizing problems systematically." Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came from seeing the students succeed, not just in immediate tasks, but in developing the fundamental skills that would serve them throughout their career. Tyler's progress represented exactly what she hoped to achieve as an instructor, helping pilots develop not just technical competence, but the confidence and judgment that separated adequate aviators from exceptional ones. "The credit belongs to you," Elena replied. "I just helped you access capabilities you already possessed. Good instruction points students toward their own strengths rather than trying to impose external solutions. Webb stood and moved to the wall display that featured photographs of Horizon Airlines instructors and their achievements. "Elena, I'd like to add your photograph to this display, along with a description of your background and qualifications. I want every pilot who trains here to understand that expertise can come from unexpected sources, and that the best instructors are those who faced real challenges and learned from their experiences." Elena looked at the wall of photographs, seeing the faces of men and women who had dedicated their careers to sharing knowledge and developing safer aviation practices. Adding her image to that display would represent the final step in her emergence from invisibility, the public acknowledgement that she belonged in the community of professional aviators who shape the industry's future. "I'd be honored," Elena said simply. As the group dispersed to attend to their various responsibilities, Elena remained in Webb's office for a few additional moments, processing the extraordinary changes that had transformed her life in just 3 weeks. The woman who had pushed a cleaning cart through these same hallways was gone, replaced by someone who had reclaimed her professional identity and found new purpose in teaching others. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Sarah, who lived with Elena's ex-husband in Phoenix. The bitter custody battle that had been part of Elena's original exile had evolved over time into a more civilized co-parenting arrangement, particularly after the official clearing of Elena's record had undermined the character assassination that had influenced the original custody decision. "Mom, saw the article about you in Aviation Weekly. So proud of you for never giving up. Can't wait to visit and see you in your instructor uniform. Love you." Elena smiled as she read the message, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the Colorado sunshine streaming through the office windows. Sarah's support and pride meant more than any professional recognition or career advancement. The knowledge that her daughter could see her as someone who overcame adversity rather than someone defeated by it justified every difficult decision Elena had made during her years of exile. Rachel Kim appeared in the doorway, carrying a stack of weather reports and wearing the satisfied expression of someone bringing good news. "Elena, thought you'd like to know that the training scenarios you've developed are being reviewed by the FAA for possible inclusion in national certification standards. Your emphasis on decision-making under pressure and systematic problem prioritization is exactly what the industry needs." Elena felt a surge of pride at Rachel's announcement. Having her training techniques recognized at the national level represented validation that went beyond personal vindication to suggest that her experience could benefit pilots throughout the commercial aviation system. The knowledge gained through years of challenging flying and hard-won expertise could now influence safety standards that might prevent accidents and save lives on a much larger scale. "The investigation into your ex-husband's conduct has also concluded," Rachel continued with obvious satisfaction. "The FAA found evidence of systematic harassment and abuse of authority that affected multiple female pilots over several years. His captain's license has been suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing." Elena received this news with mixed emotions. She felt vindicated by the official recognition that her treatment had been unjust, but she also understood that her ex-husband's downfall, however deserved, represented the destruction of another pilot's career. The cycle of professional destruction that had nearly consumed her was now claiming the person who had initiated it, but Elena took no pleasure in his suffering. "I hope other women won't have to go through what I experienced," Elena said quietly. "If his suspension prevents future harassment, then maybe some good can come from all of this." As the afternoon progressed, Elena found herself walking through the terminal areas where she had spent 2 years invisible and anonymous. Airport staff who had barely acknowledged her existence as a cleaning person now greeted her with respect and warmth. The transformation was striking, but it also served as a reminder of how easily people could be overlooked when others decided they weren't worth noticing. She paused at the window overlooking the main runway, watching as a Horizon Airlines regional jet lifted off into the clear Colorado sky. The aircraft climbed steadily toward the mountains, its path controlled by pilots who had trained in the facility where Elena now worked, guided by procedures she was helping to refine and improve. Elena Rodriguez had started this journey as a woman driven into exile by circumstances beyond her control, forced to hide her identity and capabilities to survive in a world that had rejected her. She was ending it as someone who had not only reclaimed her professional identity, but found new purpose in ensuring that other pilots would be better prepared for the challenges that defined modern commercial aviation. The cleaning cart that had been her constant companion for 2 years sat unused in a storage closet, replaced by the flight instruction materials and training aids that represented her return to meaningful work. But Elena would never forget the lessons learned during her time of invisibility, the understanding that competence and expertise could be found in unexpected places, worn by people whom others had decided weren't worth their attention. As the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Elena prepared for another evening of developing training scenarios and reviewing student progress. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pilots to instruct, new opportunities to share knowledge that could make the difference between safe operations and preventable accidents. The woman who had once been invisible had become someone whose influence would extend far beyond the regional training facility where she had chosen to rebuild her career. Elena Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the most powerful statement wasn't proving others wrong, but proving to yourself that setbacks were temporary and that expertise, once developed, could never truly be taken away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.